By 2050, up to 216 million people may be forced to move within their own countries because of climate change. Not because of war, not because of invasion, because parts of the world may slowly become harder to survive in. Entire coastlines facing rising seas, cities overheating under record temperatures, farms drying out, floods destroying homes again and again until rebuilding no longer makes financial sense. And the unsettling question becoming louder every year is this: what happens when millions of people begin moving at the same time?
And before we begin today's episode, we want to explain something important to our listeners and debate students. This episode is actually part one of a two-part debate series. Today is not the full debate itself. Today is what we call framing the world.
That's right. This can be a tricky debate to navigate, and it falls under scenario motions and counterfactual debates. One of the biggest mistakes students make is jumping straight into arguments before they fully understand the future world, the pressures shaping it, the stakeholders involved, and the trajectory society may already be moving toward. And honestly, that's why these motions are difficult.
For sure, in a normal policy debate, you can ask, should we do this policy? But in a scenario motion, the debate becomes, what kind of future world is emerging? Or, which force will define society the most? That requires a completely different type of thinking. So, episode 12 is about understanding the world of the motion. Let's get busy, coach!
Welcome back to the Crown Academy Debate Podcast. I'm Coach Mike.
I'm Kai.
And I'm Nova.
And today's episode is one of the biggest future world debates we've ever done. Not just environmental, not just political, civilizational. Today's motion is, this House believes that climate migration will become the defining geopolitical issue of the 21st century.
And before we jump in, Coach Mike, I think this is important for listeners because this debate feels a little different from our normal policy debates. We're not really debating, should governments pass one specific law? This feels more like we're debating, what kind of world are we moving toward?
Exactly. This is what we'd call a scenario motion or counterfactual style future world debate. Instead of debating only what currently exists, we analyze the following: future pressures, emerging systems, hypothetical consequences, and competing visions of what society could become. So the debate isn't, will climate change exist? That's not the interesting question anymore. The real question is, how much will climate disruption reshape human movement, politics, economics, and stability? And even deeper, could migration itself become the defining pressure shaping the century?
Which honestly sounds dramatic at first, but when you start looking at the trends, it becomes harder to dismiss. Because climate migration isn't science fiction anymore. It's already happening in smaller forms around the world. People relocating after repeated floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, crop collapse, water shortages. The difference is scale. The concern is what happens when those pressures accelerate simultaneously.
And I think that's the part people underestimate. Migration doesn't just affect geography, it affects housing, jobs, infrastructure, elections, healthcare, food systems, social tensions. Like, imagine millions of additional people suddenly moving into already struggling cities. We already complain about expensive housing, overcrowding, inflation, rising costs. Now, imagine adding environmental pressure on top of that.
Exactly right. And history shows us something important. Large-scale migration has always reshaped politics. Always. The fall of empires, urban revolutions, border conflicts, economic instability. Population movement changes societies. The reason this debate matters is because climate migration may not be one isolated event. It may become permanent background pressure, and that's a very different kind of geopolitical challenge.
But I do think we should be careful not to turn this into pure apocalypse storytelling. Because one of the weaknesses in climate discussions online is that everything becomes civilization collapses tomorrow. And reality is usually more complicated than that. Humans adapt, technology changes, infrastructure evolves, cities redesign themselves. So I think the opposition side of this debate has a strong argument that climate migration will matter, but it may not become the defining geopolitical issue. There are other huge threats too: AI disruption, cyber warfare, authoritarianism, economic inequality. demographic collapse.
That's fair, but I think climate migration connects to all those issues. That's what makes it dangerous. It amplifies existing instability. Like if housing markets are already struggling, climate migration worsens it. If food prices are already unstable, droughts worsen it. If politics are already polarized, resource pressure worsens it. It's like climate migration becomes a multiplier.
That's an excellent framing, and honestly, that may become government's strongest argument in this motion. Not climate migration causes every problem, but rather, climate migration intensifies existing geopolitical fractures. That's sophisticated, because the most dangerous global pressures are often not isolated disasters, they're stress multipliers.
And we're already seeing hints of that with insurance markets. I honestly think insurance companies are becoming one of the earliest warning systems for climate disruption, because unlike politics, insurance companies are forced to calculate risk mathematically. And in some regions, premiums are exploding, insurers are pulling out entirely, and rebuilding costs are becoming unsustainable. That changes human behavior fast.
That's terrifying, actually, because once people can't insure homes, or repeatedly lose property, or can't afford rebuilding, migration stops being ideological. It becomes economic survival.
Indeed. And this is where the debate becomes incredibly important, because historically, migration discussions often focused on borders, nationality, immigration policy. But climate migration introduces something different, a future where environmental pressure reshapes internal movement inside countries themselves. And listeners should understand this carefully. The famous 216 million people projection from the World Bank refers primarily to internal migration, not necessarily international refugee waves, meaning rural populations moving toward cities, coastal populations relocating inland, regions becoming economically harder to sustain. That distinction matters because sensational headlines often oversimplify it.
And honestly, internal migration may be even more politically destabilizing in some ways, because it directly pressures domestic infrastructure, local elections, urban planning, and state resources. Imagine entire regions slowly losing population while other cities absorb millions more residents. That changes everything.
And I think young people especially feel this growing anxiety that the future feels less stable than it used to. Like our grandparents imagined progress as bigger homes, stronger economies, technological optimism. Now, younger generations often imagine instability, rising costs, environmental pressure, and uncertainty. As a result, climate migration becomes symbolic of that fear.
That's a very important point, because geopolitical issues become defining, not only because they exist, but because they psychologically shape an era. The Cold War shaped the psychology of the 20th century. The War on Terror shaped the early 2000s. The question now is, what psychological pressure will define the 21st century? And government's argument is essentially, movement itself may become the defining condition of modern life. Movement caused by climate, economics, instability, survival pressure.
Yet, opposition still has an important response. Human civilization has repeatedly adapted to massive pressures before. We innovate under stress. Potential future adaptations include desalination, AI agriculture, floating infrastructure, vertical farming, redesigned smart cities, and climate engineering. So, there's also a possible future where humanity adapts faster than expected.
I think the scary part, though, is whether adaptation happens equally. Because wealthy regions adapt first, poorer regions suffer first. And historically, inequality mixed with migration pressure creates instability really fast.
And that may become the central clash of the motion, not whether climate migration exists, but whether it becomes the dominant geopolitical force shaping the century. And realistically, that depends on adaptation speed, international cooperation, technological development, political stability, and economic resilience. Which means this debate is ultimately about what kind of future humanity builds.
To be honest, this kind of framing is incredibly important for scenario and counterfactual debates because these motions can become really messy really fast if you don't first understand what the future world actually looks like, what pressures are interacting, and what the real clash points are. A lot of debaters make random predictions in these motions without actually building a believable trajectory, and that's usually where teams lose. So today wasn't just about climate migration itself, it was about learning how to think strategically about future worlds.
That's key, because scenario debates are not just what scary thing could happen. They're about probability, trajectory, comparative impact, and understanding how one change can reshape entire systems. And if you want to get better at this style of debate, definitely check out the Crown Academy Debate Breakdown series on counterfactual and scenario motions. We also included a free counterfactual motions worksheet PDF that you can download to start preparing your own strategies before episode 13. So, before the next episode, try asking yourself, what actually makes a future world believable? Because that's where elite scenario debate really begins.
And in episode 13, the actual clash begins. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Stay curious.